June 25, 1941. The air above Minsk is thick with smoke and disbelief. The Wehrmacht has been advancing for just 3 days, rolling through Belarus like a storm of iron and dust. On the ground, convoys of Panzer IIIs and IVs rumble down the scorched road toward the Dnieper, their commanders confident, even jubilant. This will be over by Christmas. One lieutenant jokes the line echoed across countless German units that week. Overhead, a faint drone rises slow, heavy, uncertain. Lieutenant Otto Bauer of Jagdgeschwader 51 tilts his Messerschmitt Bf 109 to get a better look. Below him, a strange, ungainly Soviet aircraft crawls over the tree line, its silhouette bulky, its nose thick like a sledgehammer. "What the devil is that?" he mutters. His wingman laughs through the radio static. A Coffin with wings. The thing barely seems to move its speed, pitiful compared to the sleek German fighters. Bauer drops behind it, throttles up, and with 2 short bursts from his MG-17s, watches his rounds spark off the Soviet machine's fuselage. But something feels wrong. The bullets don't bite. They ricochet harmlessly like rain off stone. The Soviet pilot doesn't even break formation. He just keeps flying straight toward the German armor column below. Seconds later, 2 small black shapes tumble from under the wings. A moment later, the road below erupts a line of fire and shattered metal. The Sturmovik doesn't turn away until its work is done. Then, trailing smoke, it vanishes into the haze. The German fighters circle back, stunned. Down below, one Panzer is burning its crew, crawling out into the mud. Bauer shakes his head and mutters into the radio, "Langsam, aber tödlich," slow but deadly. But that strange, brutal-looking aircraft was the Ilyushin IL-2, a machine that within 2 years would earn the nickname the Flying Tank. When it first appeared, the Luftwaffe laughed. They thought the Soviets had built a suicide machine, a relic of desperation. In truth, they were looking at the birth of one of the most important weapons of the Eastern Front. The IL-2 was never meant to be graceful. It was built to survive. Designed by Sergei Ilyushin under orders from Stalin himself, the Sturmovik was forged with one purpose: to protect Soviet infantry and annihilate German armor. It carried an armored shell around the pilot and engine, not just plates, but an integrated steel bathtub up to 12 millimeters thick. It could absorb punishment that would rip a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt apart. Early prototypes were sluggish, underpowered, and had no rear gunner. Many pilots died in their first sorties, earning the grim nickname Flying Coffin from both friend and foe alike. But the Soviets kept refining it, even as Moscow itself was under threat. Factories in Voronezh and Kuibyshev worked day and night, often run by teenage workers, and women who'd never touched machinery before the war. They built IL-2s in freezing sheds with frost on their fingers, welding plates, and riveting armor in shifts that never ended. By the winter of 1942, the design had improved, new AM-38 engines, rear gunners added, and payloads refined for precision attacks. And that's when the laughter stopped. At the Battle of Stalingrad, Sturmoviks roared low over the Volga in pairs and triplets, skimming just above the rooftops, their cannons cutting through tanks and artillery positions like scalpels. German infantry began calling them Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. Their armor-piercing RS-82 rockets could punch through a panzer's roof, while the twin 23mm VIA cannons shredded columns of trucks and half-tracks. The Sturmovik pilots, many of them barely trained farm boys, flew in near-suicidal conditions, diving through flak and machine gun fire at treetop level. The Germans tried to adapt. They ordered their troops to spread out to camouflage more carefully, to shoot from tree lines instead of open roads. But the IL-2 had changed the rhythm of battle. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin across the entire front, couldn't be everywhere at once. As Soviet production ramped up for every German fighter shot down, another Sturmovik replaced it within days. One bitter morning in January 1943, near Orel-Oberfeldwebel, Hans Gruber of the 9th Panzer Division recalled the sound a low growl that rolled over the horizon like thunder. "You could hear them before you saw them," he said years later. And when you did, it was already too late. Dozens of IL-2s swept in low black shapes gliding just above the snowfields, rockets streaking toward fuel trucks and supply depots. Gruber watched as one after another exploded the sky, filling with orange plumes. His division already struggling to refuel ground to a halt. The Soviets struck that night, pushing them back miles. The Sturmovik wasn't just a plane, it was the voice of Soviet vengeance. Stalin himself famously said, "The IL-2 is as essential to the Red Army as bread and water." And he meant it. Entire squadrons of the aircraft became legends like the 291st Assault Aviation Division, whose pilots flew over 100 sorties each during the Kursk offensive. Many never returned, but their impact was undeniable. In the summer of 1943, at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history erupted. The steppe burned under thousands of engines. For the first time, the Sturmoviks didn't just harass German columns, they devastated them. Flying in waves of 40 or 50 at a time, they destroyed bridges' rail junctions and armored spearheads that had once seemed unstoppable. German radio intercepts recorded desperate calls. "Flieger, Flieger, Tiefflieger, enemy aircraft, low and fast." But by the time the warning came, the black shapes were already overhead, and the German advance dissolved into chaos. The laughter that had begun in 1941 had long since vanished. Luftwaffe aces, once boasting of easy kills, now dreaded the sight of the armored beast. To attack an IL-2 meant diving through its defensive gunfire and hoping to strike a vulnerable spot before it turned you into wreckage. And as the Red Army pushed west, the Sturmovik followed relentless, unyielding, and everywhere. By 1944, the Germans had a new phrase, "Wo der Sturmovik fliegt, dort stirbt die Hoffnung." Where the Sturmovik flies, hope dies. February 1944. Smolensk lies in ruins, its once proud avenues now a graveyard of burnt vehicles and half-buried artillery. Snow drifts between the shells of buildings, whispering through shattered glass and twisted steel. Overhead the hum begins again, low and distant, like the growl of an oncoming storm. Soviet ground troops trudging through knee-deep snow pause and look up. They know the sound now. They trust it. It means the Sturmoviks are coming, A formation of IL-2s appears through the overcast black silhouettes against the pale morning sky. Their wings glint briefly in the weak light before diving toward the horizon. Below them, German supply convoys snake along the road toward Vitebsk, horses, pulling sledges, trucks idling in the cold, the occasional tank moving with sluggish precision. Within seconds, the Sturmoviks are among them. Bombs fall in tight patterns, carving the road into a burning scar. Pilots fire their 23mm cannons in short, disciplined bursts, walking shells, along columns of fuel drums and half-tracks. The German soldiers scatter like insects under glass. At the front of the convoy, Feldwebel Dieter Neumann dives behind a snowbank covering his head as the earth heaves. When he looks up, the truck that carried his squad's ammunition is gone, only a crater remains. The air reeks of cordite and scorched rubber. From somewhere in the distance comes the steady thump of Soviet artillery. The IL-2s circle once more, and Neumann swears he can see their red stars gleaming through the haze. He curses, but not at the pilots, at himself at the sheer futility of it all. What the Germans didn't understand at first, what took them too long to realize, was that the IL-2 was not designed for air superiority. It was an airborne extension of Soviet artillery, a precision hammer guided by human will. Its pilots, trained in brutal crash courses, learned to fly barely above treetop height, so low that branches sometimes tore at their wings. They attacked from 50 meters, sometimes less, releasing their rockets at suicidal range to ensure accuracy. Many never made it home. Yet their losses didn't slow production. For every Stormovik destroyed, 2 more rolled off the assembly line. In Kuibyshev, in the vast frozen halls of plant number 118, women worked in silence, except for the clang of hammers and the hiss of acetylene torches. Teenage girls assembled engines. Widows of fallen soldiers riveted wing panels. We built them with our tears, one factory worker recalled decades later. Every plane carried the name of someone we had lost. On the fuselages, messages were sometimes painted in white chalk for father, for Ivan, for Leningrad. By 1944, the Stormovik had become more than a weapon. It was a national emblem. The Soviets produced them in staggering numbers, over 1,000 a month, outpacing even the Luftwaffe's capacity to respond. German divisions began to dread open daylight. Convoys moved only at night, and even then, their headlights were kept dim. The mere rumor of IL-2s nearby was enough to halt operations. Entire battalions were pinned down by the psychological weight of those low rumbling engines. At the same time, Soviet tactics evolved. The Red Air Force organized the Sturmoviks into specialized Sturmovaya Gruppe assault groups that coordinated with ground spotters and frontline infantry. The cooperation was brutal and efficient. Radio operators on the ground would mark targets with smoke grenades. Within minutes, the IL-2s descended to erase them. German anti-aircraft gunners, already outnumbered, faced new nightmare tactics. 2 or 3 Stormoviks would bait the flak positions, drawing fire, while others slipped in from the sides to deliver killing blows. In one infamous strike near the village of Prokhorovka, a Luftwaffe field report described a wall of fire descending from the clouds. Dozens of IL-2s attacked in staggered waves, reducing an entire panzer regiment's rear echelon to ash. "We fought the enemy on the ground," one surviving officer wrote, "but the real battle was above our heads." And yet, even as they conquered the skies over the Eastern Front, the IL-2's crews paid a terrible price. The aircraft's strength was also its curse. Its thick armor made it nearly indestructible, but also heavy, slow to climb, and hard to maneuver. A single engine failure meant death. A hit to the radiator, and you had 30 seconds before the engine seized. Many Soviet pilots described the sensation of flying it as wrestling with a bear made of iron. They flew anyway. Senior Lieutenant Anna Yegorovova, one of the few female Stormovik pilots, completed 243 combat sorties. Shot down twice, captured and tortured by the Germans, she survived and returned to fly again. "We were not afraid to die," she later said. "We were afraid to fail." For pilots like her, survival wasn't the measure of success. Destruction of the enemy was. As the Red Army crossed into Ukraine and pressed toward Poland, the Stormoviks flew daily, often from crude frontline airstrips of frozen mud. Mechanics worked under blackout conditions, fixing bullet holes with scrap metal, replacing engines by lantern light. Pilots slept in their cockpits, exhausted hands, raw from gripping the controls. When dawn broke, they took off again. The rhythm of war became mechanical, endless and unbroken cycle of attack, repair, return. By late 1944, the IL-2's shadow reached as far as East Prussia. Villages that had once seemed untouchable now trembled at the sound of those engines. In one intercepted German field message, an officer wrote, "The Russians own the sky. Their black planes come with the dawn, and by noon, everything burns." The flying Coffin had outlived its mockery. It was now the hammer of the Red Air Force, a machine so integral to the Soviet war machine that even the word Sturmovik became synonymous with vengeance. But the war wasn't done with it yet. Ahead lay the final crucible, Berlin, where the Sturmovik would unleash its last storm, proving once and for all that what began as a joke had become the symbol of Germany's unraveling. April 1945. The air above the Oder River carries the smell of cordite oil and thawing mud. Across the water, the skyline of Berlin flickers in the distance, a jagged silhouette of collapsing empire. On the eastern bank, Soviet artillery batteries thunder without pause, shaking the ground like an endless drumbeat. Among the Red Army's forward air units, squadrons of IL-2 Sturmovix idle on makeshift airstrips gouged into the wet earth, their propellers chopping through smoke and mist. Mechanics caked in mud move between them with wrenches and fuel hoses. The men and women who had built, maintained, and flown these aircraft for 4 brutal years know this is the final storm. Captain Sergei Leonov, a veteran of over 180 sorties, climbs into his cockpit. His plane bears 37 white stars, painted under the canopy, each representing a successful strike mission. Below the nose, someone has scrawled in red paint, Za Kursk, Za Stalingrad, for Kursk, for Stalingrad. His gunner Mikhail Burenin straps in behind him, slaps the armored bulkhead twice, and says the same phrase every time they fly. If we die today, let's die over Berlin, Leonov smiles, pulls down his goggles and throttles forward. The IL-2 lurches into motion, its heavy frame bumping along the muddy strip before lifting into the gray dawn. Over the radio command orders come through target German positions east of Karlshorst. Fuel depots and armored columns moving west. The Sturmovix form up in tight arrowhead formations, their wings just meters apart. Below the landscape looks like a wound forest stripped bare by shellfire roads, choked with broken machinery, and rivers black with oil. German resistance has become desperate. Every bridge is mined, every crossroads defended by whatever remains of the Wehrmacht boys, old men remnants of shattered panzer divisions. At 700 meters, Leonov's formation dives. The first salvo of RS-132 rockets screams toward a column of retreating trucks tearing through them like lightning. Fire blooms across the fields reflected in the curved glass of his canopy. Anti-aircraft guns open up from the ground, tracers slicing through the haze. Leonov banks hard, feeling the jolts as shells clang against his armored fuselage. His instruments flicker, but the Sturmovik holds steady, the armor doing exactly what it was born to do. From his rear gunner's position, Burenin shouts over the intercom. 2 fighters coming in. FW-190s. Leonov glances back. 2 German aircraft dive out of the sun cannons flashing. The IL-2 jerks as one round punches through the port wing. Burenin opens up with the rear-mounted UBT machine gun tracers stitching across the sky. One of the Germans breaks off, the other keeps coming. Leonov pushes the nose down, dropping almost to treetop height, weaving between columns of smoke. The Focke-Wulf overshoots, and in seconds disappears behind them. When they level out again, Burenin is laughing half in relief, half in disbelief. Still alive, he says. Leonov answers, "Then keep shooting." This was the reality of the final months. Every sortie over Germany was a death sentence waiting to be written. But the IL-2's presence, thousands of them, now sweeping west, became a physical manifestation of inevitability. German anti-aircraft units were overwhelmed, their ammunition dwindled, their skies belonged to the Red Star. Where the Sturmovix flew, columns burned, and front lines broke. Even in the chaos, discipline remained. Soviet air commanders coordinated each strike with artillery timing so tight that some German positions were destroyed twice within minutes, first from the air, then from the ground. One captured German sergeant later testified, "It felt like the sky itself had turned against us. You could not run, you could not hide. You prayed only that they would run out of rockets." But the IL-2 crews were running on fumes of fuel of sleep of years of loss. Many had seen the front shift thousands of kilometers and watched comrades vanish in clouds of fire. For some of this final campaign was not victory, but exhaustion. Leonov's squadron alone had started the war with 20 aircraft. Now only 7 remained. Yet none hesitated when orders came for another sortie. On April 30th, 1945, the same day, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his bunker. Beneath the Reich Chancellery, the IL-2s flew their last major assault over Berlin. They bombed the city's southern districts, tearing through ammunition depots and flak batteries still firing into the night. When the Soviet flag rose above the Reichstag 2 days later, it wasn't just an army that had triumphed, but a machine forged in desperation, dismissed by the enemy, and perfected by sacrifice. In total, more than 36,000 Sturmoviks had been built, the single most produced combat aircraft in human history. But the numbers hide the cost: over 11,000 lost in combat, thousands of pilots dead or missing, countless others crippled. Still, the IL-2 had achieved what no one had believed possible in 1941. It had transformed from a flying coffin into the steel spine of Soviet air power. When peace finally came, those who survived returned to empty villages, silent factories, and a country bled dry. Some pilots kept flying, others couldn't bear to. The Sturmoviks were stored, dismantled, or melted into plows. But for a generation of soldiers, its shadow remained the low growl that had once signaled both terror and salvation. Years later, Otto Bauer, the same Luftwaffe pilot who had first mocked the ungainly machine over Minsk, stood at a veterans gathering in Munich and spoke quietly to a Soviet guest. "We laughed when we saw it," he said, "and then we learned respect. Your IL-2, it didn't just fight us, it outlasted us." The man he spoke to, gray-haired and stooped, simply nodded. "We called her the Hunchback," he replied. "She carried all of us on her back." Outside, rain drummed softly on the window. The war had ended decades ago, but for a moment both men could still hear it. The echo of engines, the roar of rockets, and the iron wings of the flying coffin that refused to die.